old, so I don't remember her. So she was just kind of like always the only grandmother I ever had on that side of the family. And so my grandfather married her when I was just maybe in elementary school. And we usually visited them every Sunday afternoon. I was always the Sunday afternoon grandparents to go and visit, for those of you who had that sort of experience. And we would visit along with my mom's two sisters and their families. And so Sunday afternoons are always this fun day of visiting the grandparents with my mom's family. And while those Sunday afternoons were really special, important, awesome times, I think my best memories with those grandparents and family was the occasional times we went fishing together. My grandpa loved fishing, like seriously loved fishing. And he really loved us grandkids, naturally. And so these days when we put those two things together was always an awesome, awesome, awesome day. Now there's two core ingredients to these fishing days. One was the food, naturally, that Grandma would always make. She always made, like, terrible for you health-wise, but this breaded chicken that was just fried chicken. It was so good. So she'd make that and the apple crisp. Grandma's apple crisp. There may have been vegetables or something else like that, but I have no idea. I don't remember eating any of that stuff. It was probably a party day where us grandkids didn't need to eat ourselves or bother ourselves with that stuff. So the first part was the food that Grandma made, and the second part, obviously, the fishing. Now, we always went to this little lake outside of Punxsutawney to fish. The same place every time we would go. And while Grandpa would fish like in the main part of the lake where like the real fishermen would fish, us grandkids would go over to this little inlet and fish. And fish is probably not really the right word to use. I mean, it was only like 2 or 3 feet deep and so shallow you could see the fish going through there. And so we would take our fishing poles and we'd take it over to Grandpa to put a little grub on there. And we'd come over and we'd dip our fishing rod in there just trying to entice the little fish onto the fishing rod. So we would catch another little 4 to 6 inch bluegill every 10 minutes or so. And we'd take it over to Grandpa and ask him to get it off the line and put another grub on there. And we'd go back over and dip our lines in there in front, like right in front of the fish's faces so they'd see it because, they had to see the, Repeat over and over all day long. I don't remember Grandpa catching many fish on his own. Fishermen always have good stories, right? I'm sure all of you who raise your hands probably have some really good stories also. I have found that with fishermen. Maybe you have stories of going fishing with family members. Maybe you have stories like I heard yesterday from Dick Roth of going fishing with buddies on these fishing trips to the Great Lakes or someplace like that. Maybe the closest you've come to fishing is watching river monsters on TV. I'm going fishing. We'll go with you. And off they go. Sounds nice, right? Gospel, Peter, let's go fishing, guys. Let's do this thing. Conjures up those old memories of fishing with Grandpa, right? Or going fishing with your buddies out on the icy lake or one of the Great Lakes or whatever your fishing stories might be. The problem is, that's not even close to what's going on in this story. At least that's what I realized this week the more I thought about it. The writer of this book, the Gospel of John, is trying to make a really big point here with these guys heading off fishing. I mean, think about it. Think about this. Jesus has died now and been resurrected, right? At this point, he's already shown up to these disciples twice. They know he's alive. They know that everything that he has taught them and predicted to them is now true. 3 years that they have spent learning his way of life, healing people, caring for the sick, empowering the poor, learning Jesus' radical way of life, and giving themselves to it, being transformed by Jesus to continue his movement. It's all good. It's real. Jesus has proved it now. It wasn't in vain. But now, these guys, they're going fishing. Do you see the irony here? Do you get it? Do you see the ridiculousness of these guys going fishing? Do you get it? Fishing was what these guys used to do before they met Jesus. This was their way of life. This is what they did, their vocation. Fishing is the old way of doing things. Fishing, for these guys, wasn't something they just did for fun with Grandpa. It was this difficult and arduous way of life that Jesus called them from and has released them from for something better. Following Jesus. When they started following Jesus and Jesus' way of life, they left fishing. And now despite Jesus actually showing up for them, despite Jesus proving this resurrection, these knuckleheads are back there in the lake fishing again. Can you imagine the frustration of Jesus? I'm going fishing. We'll all go with you. And off they go. To prove the lunacy of their thinking, the writer of John even writes, they got into their boat by night. You know what that means. And they caught nothing. At night, only bad things happen in John's gospel. And guess what? Guess what they catch? Nothing. They catch nothing when they go back to their old ways of living and not following Jesus. Shocker there, right? Well, then beautifully, morning comes, right? Light. The light of morning comes, and Jesus appears. And he merely gives a little bit of direction. Cast your nets on the right side of the boat. They're probably thinking, we've been casting the nets on all sides of the boat, and we haven't caught a doggone thing all night long, Jesus. What are you, a fisherman? You called us from this fish. So Jesus merely casts his hand out there and tells them where to fish, and the nets are abundant with fish, right? Their nets are filled with many large fish, 153 we find. And though naturally, even bursting with fish, these nets don't break with Jesus in charge. It couldn't be much clearer, right? How these disciples have been fools again. In their weakness, in their untrusting, they abandon all that Jesus has taught them, his whole way of life, and they go back to the old way of things, back to the stinking fishing shores of the sea. And when you abandon Jesus' way of life, things don't go well. They are unsuccessful by themselves. A failing and losing effort it is without Jesus. However, when Jesus shows up and you start trusting and following him again, things turn around immediately. And so finally, after breakfast, Jesus has his confrontation with Peter, right? The greatest of the disciples, the chosen one, the leader, the one who really initiates this, let's go back to fishing again, guys, right? This whole return to fishing and quit following Jesus. Peter, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, I've always thought of that question, maybe you have too, as a little unfair for Jesus to ask. I've always thought that Jesus was asking Peter, if he loved Jesus, Peter, do you love Jesus more than all the other disciples love Jesus? Which is an unfair question, right? How's he supposed to know how much the other disciples love Jesus? It's really kind of presumptuous to assume that I love Jesus more than everybody else does. Peter, son of John, do you love me more than all the rest of these guys love me? But what if Jesus is not asking that question? After Bible study this week, I understand this question from Jesus in a totally different way. Thank you, Tim Dawes. I think it is a way that's much more in line with Jesus and makes much more sense. What if Jesus is asking Peter if he loves him more than he loves the other disciples? Peter, son of John, do you love me, Jesus, more than you love these? That is, in essence, what Peter has done and said, right? After following Jesus for 3 or so years, watching him die, be resurrected, he's still going back to the stupid old ways of fishing. He's still caught up in the past and with the world. Peter, son of John, do you love me more than this? Every Sunday we come to this place and we begin our worship with confession. That would be days when there isn't a beautiful baptism. We begin with confession and forgiveness. Every Sunday we are asked this question by Jesus. Do you love me more than all this other stuff you're confessing? Mike, do you love me more than this? Jan, do you love me more than this? Fred, do you love me more than this? And every Sunday, we confess again that we find ourselves in bondage to sin and not loving Jesus more than our stuff. We find ourselves loving our stuff. We find ourselves loving our money. We find ourselves loving a whole lot of things and not Jesus or His way of life. We find ourselves right back in the fishing boat with our nets in our hands, despite having confessed last time that we were done with that whole way of life. Jesus can see the guilt in Peter's eyes, no matter what his words say. I mean, his mouth says, I love you, Jesus, right? You know I love you, Lord. But the fishing line in his pocket and the smell of fish on his hands denies that truth. And yet, as guilty as Peter is, and oh, is he guilty, as guilty as he could possibly be, Jesus ends this admonition of Dear Peter with the same invitation that has always been available for Peter. Follow me. Follow me. That is Jesus' invitation for you. Whatever fishing hole you have been visiting, whatever fishing equipment you have in your pockets, whatever that fishy smell is on your bodies, hear Jesus' invitation to walk away from that, to leave it behind you. Jesus invites you to a way that is much simpler and much better for you. In some ways it may be more difficult, but you will love it and find much more peacefulness in that watering hole, the baptismal watering hole. Do you love Jesus more than you love this? Lord, you know that I do. Follow me. Amen.